So I'm going to be looking at these three works. This engraving, and this sculpture. And what all of these have in common that's quite different from what's happening with the computer program and what's different from what's happening in the comics and graphic novels that Peter Murphy will talk about, is that here stories are told by way of a single fixed image. But these single fixed images are doing a lot. They're operating on a number of different levels. They, in each case, seem to evoke a number of episodes in one contained narrative. But more than that, they sort of collapse time on a bigger scale. And as a result, they call into question some of our assumptions about the fixedness of place as well. And because each of these are depictions of the Christian God, for believers, all of this has really sort of significant devotional import. So what I'll try to do is I'll talk about each of these in sequence. I will encourage you to come look at these afterward, because unless you've got much better eyesight than I do, it's pretty hard to see them from that distance. But I'll try to sort of evoke the details that I'm talking about as I go. So the first work that I'm going to discuss is by Schongauer, dates to 1475. And it depicts a moment or a series of closely connected moments concerning Christ's passion. And so on one level, we can understand it as a kind of visualization of the account of Christ's passion, which is his time of suffering, that appears in the Bible. I'm just going to read you a passage from the Gospel of John in this respect, to give you a sense of the details here, and then talk about the details for a moment. This is from the Gospel of John, chapter 19, verse 1 to 5. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him on the face. Pilate went out to them again and said to them, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man. Take him home." And so we see here Christ in the center. He wears the crown of thorns. He is wearing the purple robe. He is surrounded by the soldiers that are abusing him. So on one level, it's a fairly straightforward account of sort of historical moment or sequence of moments. But there are details here that complicate this reading. And the first that I want to point to is the fact that the tormentors here are very carefully arranged in a circle around Christ. More than that, they all have these sort of grimaces and growls and sort of open, yawing mouths. Now, on one level, this may be part of an attempt to caricaturize these soldiers as Jews according to current anti-Semitic propaganda. But on another level, they're quite clearly intended, because there's a tradition here, to evoke a number of verses in one of the Old Testament Psalms, Psalm 21. Verse 17, for example, says, and this is the psalmist, the author, saying this, "For dogs are all around me, a company of evildoers encircles me." And another verse in the same psalm, verse 13, says, "They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion." So, by way of this manipulation of details, this biblical event has been given a kind of deep history. And it's as if this is simultaneously then a depiction of a moment in Old Testament antiquity and a moment in New Testament historicity, let's say. And the point of this may well be to suggest that kind of continuity for all of sacred history in Christian terms. It's a potent idea. But there's more going on here. And you'll notice that this historical narrative with this kind of deep Old Testament component to it also involves some architecture. And that architecture, with its pointed arches and its ribbed vaults, is quite clearly Gothic. And in Schongauer's world, that reads as contemporary architecture. So somehow this has been sort of also pushed up into the present tense. And in being pushed up like this, you can also see it's not just any architecture, but it's a kind of half-circle space. And Gothic architecture appeared most often in churches, and it's a kind of apse space. And Christ here in the center is sitting on what we can read as an altar. So on yet another level, not only is this sort of rendered present, given a present tense component, but Christ is to be understood here as effectively the Eucharist on the altar. And we are to understand the picture as sort of declaring the truth of the doctrine of real presence, which is the notion that Christ in his blood and body was truly present in the Eucharist. So it has all of these sort of levels that bring this historical scene into the kind of here and now of our world, or of the world of the original intended viewers, at least. So turning to this second engraving, this is by Albrecht Dürer. It's pretty close in time to this one, but 25, 30 years later, 1509. And it seems on the face of things to be quite a similar depiction. That is, it shows the suffering Christ again. And many of the same details are present as in the first depiction we just talked about. In that you can see here, Christ now has beside him the column, which has the rope that alludes to his flagellation, his flogging. He also holds the whip and something like a sort of branch, another kind of whip, two kinds of whips. So this suggests the moment of the flagellation. He has the crown of thorns on his head, which suggests that scene of being brought out as presented as he is here. And then at this little detail here at the back, you can see actually the cross, actually three crosses from Calvary, where his suffering will sort of culminate right in his crucifixion. So on one level, again, it's a kind of vision of Christ's suffering in a sort of historically specific sense. But there are oddities here, and as with the oddities here, these oddities sort of activate the complexities of this picture. For one, going back to the cross on Calvary, it's actually odd that the three crosses are up there, because according to the biblical narrative, Christ actually carries his own cross to Calvary. So that would suggest that what we're seeing here is a sort of rendering of the site after the event rather than before the event. More than that, Christ here is shown with his wounds, his nail wounds in his hands and in his feet, something that would only be seen after the event, after he had been brought down from the cross. More than that still, you can see the wound in his side, which would relate to the wounds in his hands, but there's actually blood spurting from the wound, which suggests not even a moment after, but a moment actually during the crucifixion, because the story goes that he was stabbed after he had been thought to have died on the cross. He's stabbed by the spear bearer, and that spurts blood. More than that still, there are these two figures here, clearly in contemporary dress, sort of praying fervently toward this figure of Christ. So what we have here is at the very least sort of four temporal realities merged into one, kind of before the crucifixion, during his suffering, in the midst of the crucifixion, right after his crucifixion, and then something in the present tense. So what does all of this mean? Well, first we can say that he's actually looking at us, clearly sort of alive, as he's dead, because this is after the crucifixion. This is a way of declaring that this person, Christ, is God, and that he has transcended death, and in doing so has made it possible for all of his followers likewise to transcend death in terms of eternal life. So there's a potent notion there as well. But there's more going on, because the very presentation of Christ, he's sort of presenting himself to be viewed, showing his wounds, and the title here gives it away, The Man of Sorrows. This is part of a reasonably long-standing tradition at this point. This is an evocation of yet another Old Testament passage, this time from the book of Isaiah. Let me just quickly read that. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of sorrows. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. So by evoking this particular Old Testament passage, again we have this kind of ratcheting of the scene to an Old Testament antiquity, which has consequences for understanding all of sacred history as being sort of Christ-centered for Christians. But more than that, this is especially a sort of calling to account. By evoking this passage, it is making clear what may not, which should already be clear. By looking at this book, which becomes even more clear, that Christ has suffered for the sins of all of us watching. So we're sort of implicated in this in a much more sort of emphatic way by way of this passage, the invocation of this passage. But there's still more happening here. That is, this very vision of the man of sorrows, standing there showing his wounds, dead but alive, is part of an important, famous story in Christian lore that involves an event on another temporal register. That is, Pope Gregory the Great, around the year 600, is thought to have had a vision. He was conducting Mass, and there were a bunch of people who were misbehaving and not thinking that what was going on there was of significance. And so he, according to the story, prayed to God to have something happen that would make these people realize the importance of the event. And so at that moment, this vision of the dead but alive Christ rose up behind the altar, behind the Eucharist, and these misbehaviors were reformed. So again, it's a kind of a reform dynamic, but it's also very specifically, once again, like this one, but by different means, a way of emphasizing the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. But there's more. Still, and it goes back to the wound here and the spurting blood. Because according to the story of the Bible, when the spear bearer pierces his side, out spurts blood and water, both. This is deemed a miracle, and that has consequences, but that event is interpreted within Christianity as a prophecy of the sacraments of the Church, of baptism, water, and the Eucharist, blood, the sort of fluids that flow from Christ in a saving fashion. And that is supposed to be, that meaning is supposed to be operative here, is made quite clear, because there are actually two jets of liquid coming out of his wound at this point, and they're landing on the two faithful here. So this is a kind of projection forward of the history of the Church, and a vision of the sort of saving power of the rituals of the Church on top of everything else. So these are extremely multivalent images, both of them. They're small, they're full of details. They're supposed to get you standing there thinking a lot about this. They're meant to be contemplative sparks as a consequence. And their goal in the end is to kind of do away with distinctions between then and now, there and here, all for the devotional benefit of the original intended viewers. This work here, which dates to about 1650, so a bit later, anonymous, has a similar sort of subject matter, but it's not quite as complicated in some ways. It doesn't have an Old Testament component. It doesn't appear to have a sort of Eucharistic component. But in other ways, because of the medium, it has a kind of charge that these ones don't. What we see here is, again, the suffering Christ. And we see a bunch of details that would evoke the various episodes of the story we discussed. We see the rope here of the flagellation. We see the purple cloak and the crown of thorns of the sort of presentation of Christ. And then blood trickling down, which sort of evokes all of his sufferings, but also potentially also sort of alludes to his coming crucifixion as well. But this work doesn't have any of the wounds. It doesn't have any of the sort of dead but alive component that the others do. That having been said, though, this is a sculpture. It's a life-sized bust of Christ that has been completely pulled out of its historical context and put right here and right now. And the medium here, then, turns this from something like, technically, narrative historical representation to something more like a bodily encounter. This is Christ, and he is here right in front of you, in your world, where you are in his world. And because this is the suffering Christ, this is very important, because if you are effectively a witness of his suffering, you are culpable. You are an enabler of that suffering. So the idea that, well, you just stood there, you saw it, but you didn't do anything, all of that dynamic comes into play here. And that has tremendous consequences for how we think of this work and engage with it. So, I'll give you sort of a sense of how these are all different from each other, but similar in some ways in the kinds of charges that they can produce. I mean, these single multivalent entities. When these were put in, I just happened to look at that photograph. And I thought to myself, first, that's of Niagara Falls, and that's kind of cool because I'm Canadian, and so it helps to sort of merge my then and now, as it were. But I started to think about the relationship of that photograph to this work in particular. Obviously, it's very different, right? This is a very old, very religious, devotional object. That is a virtually contemporary photograph, totally secular, a depiction of the outside of a motel in Niagara Falls. But then I started to think to myself that actually the narrative strategies that these two very different works employ are actually almost identical. That is, this work produces its charge by being all subject and no setting. The setting has been eradicated. That work uses the same strategy of absence and presence, but in the reverse. That is, it's all setting and no subject. Nonetheless, both of them contain traces of what is absent as a kind of contemplative spark. So that here, you have the crown of thorns, the rope, the blood, the cloak, all of which allow you to sort of reconstruct the story, right? There, if you haven't already noticed, but you can see it from here, the trace that we have of the absent subject, rather than the absent setting, is the footprints that go from the base, the bottom of the photograph, up to that door. And it makes you think, wow, so there's someone in there. Who could be in there? What are they doing? Why have they been in there so long? Because, as you'll notice, the footsteps are kind of snowed over. then what am I doing just standing here and watching all of this, basically peeping in on this otherwise private scene? So, despite the difference, you have a similar kind of narrative strategy at play that not only forces you as the viewer to reconstruct the narrative, but implicates even the dynamics of the story in a way that's not unlike what we've seen with the computer. And in that sense, I would say we have a glimpse of the sort of power and beauty of art, that it can somehow allow us to transcend our world